If God is the creator of the universe, there's a fundamental question that comes up: who created God? Before diving into this theological dilemma, it's important to clarify that this question isn't a modern idea or a recent atheist strategy to challenge faith. In fact, it's been a topic of discussion for centuries. Philosophers, theologians, and thinkers from various times have grappled with this question, making it a central part of the debate between faith and reason. From a Christian perspective, the answer to this question is clear and crucial: God was not created. The Bible states this clearly in Revelation 1 verse 8, where God says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end." In other words, God is presented as an eternal being, with no beginning or end, whose existence isn't limited by time or the causality that governs the material universe. This concept is key in Christian theology. Unlike everything we know in the physical world, where every entity, from living beings to the cosmos itself, has an origin, God transcends these rules. The universe had a beginning, as the Big Bang theory shows, but God, according to Christian doctrine, exists outside of time and space, not depending on any prior cause. One of the most influential thinkers in this debate was Thomas Aquinas, who in the 13th century introduced the first cause argument in his work Summa Theologica. Aquinas argued that everything that exists has a cause, but there can't be an infinite chain of causes. At some point, there must be an uncaused cause, a necessary being that explains the origin of everything without needing a prior cause. According to his reasoning, that being is God, the unmoved mover that initiates existence without being created. However, this idea has faced criticism, especially in modern times. Biologist and science communicator Richard Dawkins, in his book The God Delusion, argues that proposing God as the ultimate explanation doesn't solve the problem, but just pushes it to another level. His point is that if we need a cause for the universe, the same logic should apply to God. This argument has fueled the debate between theism and atheism, particularly in the context of the relationship between science and religion. Meanwhile, physicist Stephen Hawking offered an alternative view in The Grand Design. According to his perspective, the universe could have originated without the need for a creator, as a result of physical laws like gravity. This hypothesis challenges the idea of God as the necessary first cause and supports an interpretation of the cosmos's origin based solely on scientific principles. Despite these objections, the Bible directly addresses this issue. In Exodus 3 verse 14, when Moses asks God for his name, the response is, "I am who I am." This statement implies that God doesn't depend on anything to exist. He is existence itself, without origin or the need for an external cause. In theological terms, this concept is known as the aseity of God, meaning his existence comes from himself and not from any other source. In conclusion, the question about the origin of God remains a point of debate between faith and reason. While Christianity holds that God is eternal and uncreated, modern scientific and philosophical perspectives continue to explore alternative explanations for the origin of the universe. In any case, this question remains one of the most profound and challenging topics in human thought. The Christian view of God's nature has lasted for millennia, but not everyone accepts it. Many skeptics criticize the idea that God has no beginning, seeing it as a way to dodge the fundamental question. They argue it's a convenient excuse or doesn't make logical sense, because everything else must have a beginning. It's understandable that this objection arises, since our perception is limited by the rules of cause and effect that govern our world. However, according to Christian theology, God transcends these limitations. He's not bound by the same rules as the rest of creation. His nature is radically different, which raises the debate to new levels. On one side, you have the theist position, which holds that God is the ultimate answer, eternal, without needing a creator, just simply existing. On the other side, thinkers like Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking challenge this idea, arguing that seeing God as the ultimate cause doesn't solve the problem, but just pushes it to another level of complexity. One of the most surprising concepts in Christianity is God's eternity. We're talking about a being that exists outside of time and space, completely beyond the limits of our everyday experience. In this sense, Christian doctrine says that God has no beginning or end. He didn't start at any point in time and, according to the Christian faith, he will never end. This idea is clearly stated in Revelation 22 verse 13, where God is presented as the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. This concept isn't just a symbol or metaphor. Christianity teaches that God literally transcends time limits. He doesn't age or progress through history. He simply is, and for him, past, present, and future are timeless. This can be hard to grasp because we're so used to living within time structures. We count the days, measure time, and are bound by the cycles of life. But God, according to this view, operates in a completely different dimension, unaffected by the limits of time. This idea is also present in the Old Testament. In Psalm 90 verse 2 it says, "Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from eternity to eternity, you are God." This statement emphasizes that God has always existed, even before creation itself. This idea raises deep questions. It's tough for our minds to comprehend existence without a beginning or end, since our reality is built around cycles of start and finish. We're born, we live, we die. However, when we talk about God's eternity, we're entering completely different conceptual territory, with no start or origin story. To strengthen this idea, Isaiah 40 verse 28 mentions that the Lord is the eternal God, the creator of the universe, the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. This verse highlights that God isn't subject to physical or intellectual wear and tear. His existence doesn't have the limits we know. He's been here forever and will be here forever. This concept isn't just a specific feature of Christian belief. It's a fundamental principle. Let's think about this. If God had been created, he wouldn't truly be God. He'd just be another being within the created order, subject to time, decay, and the limitations that govern our reality. The essence of God in Christianity is that he transcends those limitations. He's not a product of the world, but the creator of everything that exists. Saint Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential Christian philosophers of antiquity, explored this idea in depth. He lived in the 4th century, and his writings continue to be a key influence in modern Christian theology. Augustine was deeply fascinated by the relationship between time and eternity. In his work Confessions, he developed the idea that God's eternity means that he is the creator of time itself. Let me get you to think about this. God didn't just create the universe, he created time. Before God said, "Let there be light," not a single moment of time existed. Augustine argues that time itself was created by God, meaning he's not bound by it like we are. I get it. You might be wondering, what does this have to do with me? The key here is that God's eternal nature changes how we understand existence. If God is eternal, then he has an absolute and definitive perspective. He doesn't view human history like we do, with one event happening after another. He sees it all in one single moment, from the beginning to the end. This is the foundation of the Christian belief. God has complete knowledge of the future. He's already present in every moment, all at once. The implications of this are huge. If God is eternal, his knowledge is infinite. He doesn't just know what will happen, he's already in the future. This is what makes God's plan so powerful. It's not just a blueprint that unfolds as events happen, but a plan he's already seen the conclusion of because he's present at all points of time, simultaneously. The Bible makes a profound statement: God is eternal. It's not just an abstract idea, but a central aspect of the Christian belief. This concept, though challenging, sets God apart from everything else in the universe. God doesn't have an origin story because, according to Christian theology, he is the origin of everything else. Now, brace yourself, because the next part will really challenge your understanding of existence itself. Let's dive into the ontological argument, and I promise it's a transforming concept. Let's talk about Anselm of Canterbury, a philosopher and theologian from the 11th century who tackled some of the most profound questions about God. The core of Anselm's famous ontological argument goes like this: God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. It might sound complex, But stick with me. Anselm is saying that God, by definition, is the greatest being that can be imagined. He's so great that we can't conceive of anything greater. The key point is this: if God only existed in our minds and not in reality, then we could imagine a being that exists in reality as well, one that's even greater. But if we could conceive of something greater than the being that only exists in our minds, then that wouldn't really be God. In short, Anselm tells us that the very concept of God implies that he must exist in reality. A God that exists in reality is greater than one that only exists as an idea or thought. Anselm's conclusion is clear: if you can conceive of God, then he must exist. If he didn't exist, he wouldn't be the greatest possible being because, to truly be the greatest, he must exist in reality. I understand that this idea might sound abstract, but Anselm's argument had a profound impact on medieval philosophy, and it wasn't just some random thought. His reasoning was carefully structured to show that the existence of God is a necessary truth, not just a possibility. According to Anselm, we can't even think of God without recognizing his existence. This is a bold claim that sparked intense debates. One of the most notable responses to Anselm came from one of his contemporaries, Gournalo of Mercer. Gournalo challenged Anselm's argument by saying, simply, that if you can imagine the greatest possible island, does that mean it must exist? In other words, Gournalo argued that imagining something doesn't mean it has to exist in reality. He believed there was a flaw in Anselm's reasoning. You can't deduce the existence of something just because you imagine it. Gournalo's critique became one of the first major challenges to the ontological argument. But Anselm wasn't intimidated. He responded by saying that God isn't like an island or something we can simply imagine because, in his view, God is a necessary being. Unlike any other concept we can have, God doesn't depend on anything for his existence. His existence is essential and inherently tied to what it means to be God. Fast forward to modern philosophy, and Anselm's argument is still a relevant topic. Immanuel Kant, one of the most influential philosophers of the Enlightenment, also took issue with this reasoning. Kant argued that existence isn't a predicate, meaning it's not something that can be added to the definition of something to make it real. According to Kant, you can't use existence as a property to prove something exists. However, Kant's criticism didn't invalidate Anselm's argument. It actually just deepened the debates. Contemporary philosophers like Alvin Plantinga have revived the ontological argument with new approaches. Plantinga, for example, used modal logic, a philosophical tool that explores possibilities and necessities, to bring this thousand-year-old debate back into the spotlight and keep it relevant in modern philosophy. Now, let's move on to one of the most intriguing questions people often ask. Does God need a cause? This concept is simple. Everything we know in the universe seems to require a cause. A tree doesn't grow without a seed, a building doesn't appear without someone building it, and of course, a person doesn't come into the world without parents. But when it comes to God, the situation is different. In Christianity, the concept of causality doesn't apply to God. It might sound surprising, but the fundamental belief is that God is unique in his nature. He doesn't need a cause because he himself is the uncaused cause. This concept of God as the uncaused cause is deeply rooted in Christian philosophical tradition, dating back to the early Church Fathers. A clear example is Athanasius of Alexandria, a 4th century theologian who defended this same idea. Athanasius argued that God is self-sufficient by nature, not dependent on anything to exist. His existence comes from his own being, and there's nothing or no one that precedes or controls him. This concept is known as aseity, a fancy term for saying that God exists by himself. The idea that God doesn't need a cause is closely tied to his eternal nature. Unlike everything else in the universe, God didn't have a specific beginning. He wasn't born into existence. He's always existed. That's why when someone asks, "Who created God?" it's like asking who created time. God is beyond creation itself. A good parallel can be found in Aristotle's philosophy. Although he wasn't Christian, his ideas deeply influenced later Christian thought. Aristotle introduced the concept of the unmoved mover, which directly relates to this topic. According to Aristotle, Everything that's in motion needs something to put it in motion, but at some point, there must be something that starts all the motion without being moved itself. For Aristotle, that principle was the unmoved mover, the ultimate cause of everything, which doesn't need to be caused. When Christianity adopted this perspective, God was conceptualized as the primary mover, the uncaused cause behind everything that exists in the universe. You might be wondering, why doesn't God need a cause if everything else does? That's a great question. Causality refers to things that have an origin, things that come into existence at a specific moment in time. But, according to Christian belief, God doesn't have a beginning. He's always been present. In Genesis 1 verse 1, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Notice it doesn't say that God was created. It just assumes his existence, setting the stage for creation. The Bible doesn't say that God was created because, in Christian theology, he wasn't. He's the one who gives rise to creation. This is where Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century philosopher, comes into play. He merged Aristotle's ideas with Christian thought in a way that's still relevant today. Aquinas came up with 5 arguments to prove the existence of God, and one of them is the argument from motion, closely related to causality. Thomas argues that everything in the universe is in motion because it was set in motion by something else, but we can't trace this chain back forever. Eventually, there must be a starting point. That point, according to Aquinas, is God. God is the first cause, the unmoved mover, who starts all the motion but doesn't require anything to move him. The key conclusion here is that God doesn't need a cause because he's outside the chain of causality. He's not part of the universe subject to the rules of time and causality. He's the creator of those rules. It's like asking why an author isn't limited by the world they've created in a book. The author exists in a completely different dimension. This is how Christian theology describes God. He created time, space, and the laws that govern the universe, but is not bound by them. A key passage that highlights this idea is found in Exodus 3 verse 14, when God reveals himself to Moses from the burning bush and says, "I am who I am." It's a statement of self-existence, where God declares, "I exist because I exist. I don't depend on anything else for my being. I simply am." Now, we're entering into a more intellectually complex area with the Kalam cosmological argument, where science and theology meet, making it one of the most persuasive arguments for defending the existence of God in contemporary Christian apologetics. What's interesting about this argument is that it's not just based on philosophical concepts, it also incorporates scientific evidence and gets you to think about the very origins of the universe. Where does all of this come from? The Kalam argument isn't a brand new idea. It has its roots in medieval Islamic philosophy, but over time, Christian thinkers have adopted it. Today, one of the leading defenders is William Lane Craig, a contemporary philosopher and theologian who has debated prominent atheists. This argument has become a cornerstone in debates about the existence of God, and it's easy to see why. It's logical, backed by science, and extremely difficult to refute. The Kalam cosmological argument is based on a simple premise, like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Sounds simple, right? But if you really dig into it, you can see how deep this reasoning is. Let's break it down. The first premise, everything that begins to exist has a cause. This is something everyone agrees on. It's common sense. We don't expect a house to just appear out of nowhere, or a car to pop up randomly. If something exists and has a beginning, it must have had a cause. Science and everyday experience support this idea, so there's no debate about it. But here's where it gets interesting. The second premise, the universe began to exist. This is where the Big Bang theory comes into play. Yep, we're talking about that same Big Bang you probably heard about in your science classes. In 1927, astronomer Georges Lemaitre, who was also a Catholic priest, was the first to propose that the universe is expanding. Then, in 1965, scientists discovered cosmic microwave background radiation, which is left over from the Big Bang, the moment the universe started expanding from an extremely dense point. This discovery gave scientists solid proof that the universe had a beginning, which lines up with what's written in Genesis 1 verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is where the Kalam argument really picks up steam. If the universe had a beginning, it must have had a cause. Nothing comes from nothing. If the universe began to exist, something must have caused that beginning, but it couldn't have been something within the universe because it didn't exist yet. So, what kind of cause could have started the universe? This is where God comes in. The Kalam argument points to a cause that's beyond time, space, and matter, since those didn't exist before the universe began. The cause has to be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and incredibly powerful. This sure sounds a lot like the Christian concept of God, doesn't it? William Lane Craig has debated some of the most famous atheists on this, and the Kalam argument has proven to be really tough to refute. Even those who don't believe in God are challenged by the implications of a universe that has an origin. Stephen Hawking, one of the brightest minds in modern science, once said, "Almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning with the Big Bang." But then the question arises, what caused the Big Bang? Some might argue that the universe just popped out of nowhere. However, in scientific terms, nothing isn't actually nothing. Even in a vacuum, there's still quantum activity happening. Plus, if the universe did come from nothing, it would be an exception to the rule that everything that begins to exist has a cause, which would throw everything we know about the universe into doubt. Doesn't seem like a satisfying answer, right? Now, let's say for a moment that the universe did just pop up out of nowhere. Why did it happen at that specific moment and not another? There would have to be a cause that chose that exact moment for the universe to exist. That cause, according to the Kalam argument, is God. What's brilliant about this reasoning is how it leans on modern science to back up the idea of a creator. The Big Bang is one of the strongest theories in cosmology, and it lines up perfectly with the idea that the universe had a beginning. Even Einstein's theory of general relativity, which describes gravity on a cosmic scale, suggests that time and space are intertwined and have a point of origin. If science tells us that the universe had a beginning, it also must indicate that something outside the universe caused it. And don't forget, Christian theology has held this for over 2,000 years. The Bible starts with the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." This is a clear statement that the universe began long before scientists confirmed it wasn't eternal. Let's take a step back in history. We've talked about contemporary philosophers and scientists, but now let's dive into some of the most influential figures in the Christian Church, the Church Fathers. These great thinkers of their time shaped much of what we now understand as Christian theology, and they had a lot to say about the nature of God, especially concerning his existence. Let's start with Athanasius of Alexandria, a key figure. A 4th century bishop in Egypt, Athanasius strongly defended the idea that God has neither a beginning nor an end. In his work on the Incarnation, Athanasius emphasized that God exists outside of creation. God is above all things created, he wrote, insisting that while everything else in the universe was created, God simply is. He doesn't depend on anything for his existence, and his nature is eternal, existing even before time itself. What's fascinating about Athanasius is that he was fighting against Arianism, a heresy that claimed Jesus was created by God and therefore wasn't equal to him. Athanasius stood firm, arguing that both God the Father and Jesus were co-eternal, meaning they didn't have a beginning. This groundbreaking defense of God's eternal nature is still a core part of Christian doctrine today. But Athanasius wasn't the only one tackling these tough questions about God's existence. Origen, one of the most influential early Christian theologians, also addressed these issues. Born in 185 AD in Alexandria, a major intellectual hub in the ancient world, Origen worked to blend philosophy and theology. His writings played a key role in helping early Christians understand the nature of God. One of Origen's main ideas was that God is incomprehensible. What he meant was, even though we humans try to understand him, we'll never fully grasp God. In his book on First Principles, Origen wrote that God cannot be contained by the universe, nor by any place, nor by anything outside of himself. This highlights that God's existence is so far beyond our understanding that we can't even begin to conceive of it. This approach really points out something central in early Christian thought: the mystery of God's existence. God can't be limited or understood by our finite minds, which makes him a transcendent being, far beyond our categories of existence. Augustine of Hippo, another major Christian thinker, continued Origen's ideas. Born in 354 AD, Augustine is famous for his writings on time, creation, and the nature of God. In his influential book Confessions, he went deep into the idea that God is the creator of time. Augustine argued that God transcends time, meaning he's not limited by the past, present, or future, unlike us. He wrote, "You are the creator of all time, and before all time you are, and no time is co-eternal with you." It's amazing that Augustine was grappling with these ideas long before modern science started exploring the origins of the universe. He anticipated what we now know, thanks to Einstein's theory of relativity, about the relationship between time and space and their shared origin. Augustine showed that even early Christian thinkers were facing concepts that still challenge us today. The Church Fathers weren't just theorizing, they were also fighting against heresies, alternative worldviews, and their own intellectual limitations. Their work was crucial in shaping how Christians today understand God's existence. According to their view, God isn't just the biggest or most powerful being. He's outside all the categories of existence we know. He didn't just create the universe. He's completely outside of it, existing as the very definition of existence itself. What's interesting is that the Nicene Creed, established in 325 AD and still recited in many Christian churches today, reflects a lot of the ideas these fathers defended. It begins with, "We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible." This line expresses the belief that God created everything that exists, both visible and invisible, and that he exists outside of everything. One of the most remarkable qualities of the Church Fathers was their bravery. They weren't afraid to challenge dominant philosophical and religious ideas, even when those ideas were deeply rooted in culture. Thinkers like Athanasius and Augustine faced huge opposition, but they stood firm in their belief that understanding God's eternal nature wasn't just a theological issue, it was foundational to everything else. Christians believe that God's existence isn't just a philosophical or scientific argument, it's intrinsically tied to a bigger purpose. As we know, Christian theology holds that God exists outside of time, space, and the universe. But his existence is directly connected to ours from the beginning. The Bible presents the human story as a relationship between the Creator and his creation. In Genesis 1 verse 26, we read, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." This makes it clear from the very beginning that humans aren't just random products of nature. We were intentionally created in the image of a creator who is beyond all the limitations we face, yet deeply involved in our world. Here's the translated text in casual, conversational English. But here's where it gets even deeper. God's existence is key to understanding free will, moral responsibility, and human destiny. When we think about it, God's existence gives meaning to our choices, our struggles, and our purpose. Without him, what would be the ultimate purpose of life? If the universe is just made up of random particles, what would it mean to live meaningfully? According to the Christian faith, God's eternal existence provides the necessary sense for our decisions and the purpose behind our existence. It's not just that God created the universe and left us to fend for ourselves. The Bible tells a much bigger story, where God has been guiding humanity from the beginning, offering us the chance to follow him, live with purpose, and ultimately share in his eternal life. A clear example of this plan is found in the New Testament. John 3 verse 16 directly connects God's existence with our future. "For God so loved the world, that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." This verse isn't just about life after death. It's about how God's eternal existence intersects with ours in the most powerful way, through Jesus. God made it possible for humanity to share in his eternal existence, meaning our destiny is tied up with God's eternity. One thinker who captured this idea brilliantly was C.S. Lewis, the influential 20th-century Christian writer and philosopher. In his book Mere Christianity, Lewis reflected on how God's eternal nature allows him to be present in every moment of our lives, past, present, and future. Lewis explained that for God, time is a present reality, He's in all times at once. This way, He can hear our prayers today, even though He was creating the world in its beginning. This idea is amazing. God's eternity lets Him be involved in every moment of our lives, guiding us and offering us the chance to take part in His eternal plan. However, this plan isn't forced upon us. God's existence gives us the freedom to choose. The Bible makes it clear that God created us with the ability to make real decisions. In Deuteronomy 30 verse 19, He says, "I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live." This is a key point for understanding God's relationship with humanity. He exists eternally, but He gives us the freedom to decide whether to walk with Him or turn away. The conclusion is that God's existence doesn't just explain the origins of the universe, it also offers an explanation for life's ultimate purpose. The fact that God is eternal means our lives have meaning, destiny, and purpose beyond mere survival. It's about growing, learning, and being part of the bigger story God has been writing since the beginning of time. In short, we've covered philosophy, science, history, and theology, but it all comes down to this: God's eternal existence is the foundation of everything. It's not just a belief, but a way of understanding why we're here and where we're headed. Whether you're a person of faith or seeking answers, the idea of an eternal God deeply connected to the human journey is something worth exploring. It's an idea that has shaped human history and continues to provide hope and purpose to people today. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you're still watching, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and of course, subscribe for more content like this. We've got more fascinating topics coming, so stay tuned. God bless you all.